Steve, welcome to our show today. We're so honored to have you.
It's great to be here with you, Abe. Thanks for the privilege.
Well, Steve, let's start with in our conversation the beginning of your life. How did were you born here in the United States, or did you immigrate from Korea?
Yeah, I immigrated from Korea when I was 7. I was just about to turn 8, and first arrived in California, and that was sort of an entry point, and saw some family, and then but we settled in Houston, Texas, where our aunt and uncle lived, and my uncle was a NASA engineer, so they sponsored us. So we grew up in Houston.
So you went directly from Korea to LA and then straight to Houston, Texas, and you grew up there.
Yeah, LA was a stop. We had aunt and uncle there, and it was funny because our first time being in America, basically, we got picked up in a Rolls Royce. We got to go to the house on Malibu and went to Disneyland, and so it was like, oh wow, America is quite a place. But then eventually reality hit too.
Yeah, share with me your younger life. I mean, 7 years old, you must have remembered coming to the United States and those feelings that you had coming into this country, and then starting school in Houston, Texas. Were you picked on or bullied, or did you feel welcomed into where you were moving into?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a positive perception of America because I remember, growing up watching American TV shows and Sesame Street and Brady Bunch, and I remember looking at, like, there were Sears catalogs that we would look through and just saw the toys, the toy section in the Sears catalog. So I think I had a positive perception of America. And when we went to Houston, it was a mixture. There I made friends in the neighborhood and at school, even though it was almost all white school that we went to. And but then there were those experiences, those moments when you were bullied, or called a name, or felt very alienated. And those can be really traumatic. But it wasn't like it happened every single day, or it wasn't this sort of constant thing. But definitely when it happens to you, it affects you, it impacts you. And of course, I didn't verbalize it. I didn't talk to my parents about it. It was something I just kind of mostly held in, try to deal with on my own. And that was probably the unhealthiest part, is not having someone to process with, heal with, or even cry with. And so it was a mixture. I definitely made friends. I definitely, some of the teachers, didn't treat me any different, and welcomed me. But then definitely experiences bullying and being called names was part of life there.
So you spent most of your younger years, all the way through high school in the Houston, Texas area.
We left Houston in the middle, kind of toward the end of my eighth grade year. Houston was going through a tough economic time. There was like the gas crisis. This was mid '80s, and so our family decided to move to the DC area for really better economy. And so we moved, in the middle of our eighth grade year, and then I went to high school in the suburbs of DC.
Where did you live in DC area?
So we lived initially in a town called Rockville, Maryland. We moved, a couple of times after that in Bethesda. My parents finally settled in Silver Spring after I graduated, but they had their small business in DC. But that's where I went to high school, was Rockville.
So I understand your father was doing Taekwondo. Is that what he was did he open up a Taekwondo dojang?
Yeah, he had a primary business. I mean, when we first moved to DC, their business was like a little market, and it was kind of funny because they sold fresh fish and ice cream and like gifts. It was sort of a random store. But eventually they had an opportunity to actually buy a thrift store that was next door that was going out of business. So they bought this thrift store, and it was a pretty large space, and it was a large store. And so that became a huge opportunity for my parents. And so that business did well. And this was in the mid 80s. And they had enough resources that they ended up starting a Taekwondo studio as a second business. But my dad's vision was really to be a community service. Um, and he was not a Taekwondo master. He had to hire somebody to run, to teach classes and really, in some ways, run the second business. And so that's how he ended up starting, really, because he wanted to provide a service in a lower income neighborhood.
Did you spend, I'm assuming, many hours, like a lot of young Korean Americans who are growing up, supporting their family, their parents live running a store. I'm sure you spent many hours supporting your parents.
Yeah, I mean, definitely remember, probably not as much as my sisters did. I'm the youngest of three, so I was probably a little bit more spoiled than them. But definitely a lot of Saturdays, running the cash register. Um, but I have to say my sisters got probably the brunt of the responsibility. I'm the only son too, so I did get off with getting away with stuff, but and not working as hard as they did. But yeah, still a lot of days at the store, running the cash register and helping out.
What was your relationship with your parents during this time? I'm sure they were work. You just mentioned they had opened 3 businesses, and so I'm sure they were extremely busy. You were spending a lot of time at the stores on the weekends. What was their hopes and dreams? Were they hoping that you would be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or some kind of dream like that?
My parents were very unorthodox, compared to, I think, a lot of Korean parents. I mean, they worked many, many hours. I mean, during the week, I would really not see them except kind of late at night. They bring some food home, maybe, and have a very short conversation. They were tired. So, I was definitely like a typical latchkey kid. I had a lot of freedom, to be honest with you, in both good and bad ways. But their kind of parenting philosophy was very hands off. I mean, it's very unusual. And so they never really pressured me to go into any particular field or career. So, in some ways, I was probably more influenced by my friends and my sisters. And both of my sisters were, neither of them wanted to become, a doctor or a lawyer. My sister at one point, my oldest sister, I think, started to go into engineering, but then she ended up doing anthropology. My other sister did philosophy. So it's like none of us were destined to become rich, I guess, or, or super well off. But my parents were very just hands off. They just kind of like let us do our thing, but they were supportive and they wanted to financially support us and help us, but not a lot of pressure to go into certain fields.
But when you went to college, you chose, I guess, in what many would consider a non-traditional field. You went into, majored in English. You chose film and broadcasting at Boston University. How did you come about that decision?
Yeah, I think when I was in college, I was trying to figure out what do I want to even study. And so I kind of studied what I felt like I was interested in. And I probably should have actually studied philosophy instead of English. I had a greater interest in philosophy, but I'm not even sure exactly why I chose English over philosophy. And I had an interest in film and communications. But I did a lot of journalism in college. And so I wrote about music, I wrote about culture. Um, and so I thought I might go into journalism as a profession and do writing. But I just kind of chose the majors that I was interested in because my parents allowed me to. Did not pressure us into something else, and so I just really studied what I felt like I was interested in.
Why? What in particular about journalism or philosophy, for that matter, interested you? Why was it about the stories, about people's lives, and the deep thoughts of intellectuals, or what aspect of that attracted you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big picture person, so I think philosophy was a attractive to me because it was like about big ideas. It's about like the meaning of life, it's like the big questions. And I think that's always fascinated me. I think always, even as a young person, thought about like, what is the meaning of this? What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? What's morally right? What are ethics? So I think that interested me, and I liked writing, and because I felt like I had some good professors and who encouraged me. So, and I liked being able to communicate and produce something that people actually read, and journalism provided that, and so even though writing is still, I think, a painful exercise for me, but I like the fact that I could produce something that people could actually read and respond to. Um, and so there's a little bit of a practical element that there's an audience that can read my material and my views.
We'll talk a little bit about this later on, but your faith, your Christian faith, plays an important role in your current work. But is this where you maybe discovered your faith, or is it something prior to college? Because oftentimes college is an interesting time where we're reevaluating everything, all the different ideas that we grew up with. And I'm wondering how faith played into this period of your life.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in college, faith played zero role in my life because I remember going to churches growing up. It was, going to Korean churches with my parents, and probably like a lot of people feeling bored going to church. And then I remember sort of trying youth group between 8th and 9th grade, and going there and I remember going on a church retreat and just felt like, there's nothing really different about the way church kids live compared to, I said, they're all concerned about the same thing, like being popular and maybe, eventually making a lot of money. So I didn't really see anything particularly different. So I just thought, I like my school friends, or we have more common interests. So I'll just hang out with my school friends, and sort of at that point left church behind. Um, and by the time I got to college, I was a very devout atheist. I didn't believe in the existence of God. I was like, how can you believe in science and God? Like, we're all cells. And then, after we die, we're just going to become, food for worms. Like, it's just all physical. And so, yeah, faith played no role at all. I never went to a church service, never stepped foot in a church during college.
But you finished college. And this was 1993, was it? 1993. Mm-hmm. And then you started Little Lights in 95, correct?
Yes.
So something must have happened between 93 and 95. Can you take us through that journey from finishing college to when you started Little Lights?
Yeah. Yes, a lot did happen. So I graduated from college in 93. And I moved back to the DC area, and I lived with my two best friends from college. And, one of them, and I remember him being really into the stock market. He was like a rich kid from Colorado. His dad, I think, made a lot of money on real estate. He got an Alfa Romeo, convertible for his college graduation. And he was like a rich kid. And I remember he would constantly look at his stock quotes. Like, it was a sort of a form of gambling for him, I guess, and he just would constantly look at the stock quotes. But then he took a vacation and came back, and he said, "Oh, I don't care about the stock market anymore." And I was like shocked. I was like, "That's you were obsessed with the stock market before you went on vacation." And what happened was he took this drug called ecstasy, and he had such an experience on it. He was like, "This is what we've been looking for," and so he convinced me to try it, even though I had a very bad drug experience in college. So I was like very afraid to go through anything like that again. So I was very timid about trying this drug. But he convinced me. It was very persuasive. I took the drug, and then I had an incredible high on it. And I was like, I agreed with him. Like, yeah, this is what we've been looking for. And that's what drugs can do. Illegal drugs can give you that sense of bliss or high, where it's like, all your suffering, all your pain sort of feels like it disappears, and you just feel the sense of bliss. And it's really like this shortcut to, I think what we yearn for. But obviously, there's a lot of harmful effects. And so we did this for a few months together. We would go to these raves, these dance parties that lasted all night, and there was, lots of drugs around in most of these raves. And a few months in, I took a drug. We were at a rave, 5 in the morning. I was in a parking lot. All of a sudden, I was just filled with terror beyond anything. I can't even describe the fear that I experienced. And it wasn't just like a general fear of death or just, it was really like, I can only describe it as like a spiritual attack. Like I felt like there was evil, like evil spirits. And it was so intense and it wouldn't wear off. So if it was just a chemical reaction, a drug should wear off after a week or two, or, you know, at the most, but 3 weeks, right? A drug should wear off, but it was not wearing off. The intensity of the fear was not wearing off. And so I was in an existential crisis. And I didn't know what to do. I finally had to tell my parents, like, I'm like suffering. I'm like, I don't know what to do. And my parents, also didn't know what to do. They were going through their own troubles with their business. They were already stressed. They had no idea what to do. A book that actually helped me go in the right direction during this period of time was a book called The Road Less Traveled. It was written by Scott Peck. It was a bestseller in the late 80s, early 90s. I remember the first sentence of the book was, "Life is difficult." Just 3 words, "Life is difficult." And it really grabbed my attention because, one, what I was going through was like the most difficult thing that I, could ever even imagine. But it also like countered, I think, a message we receive as young Americans, right? Growing up, I remember when MTV first started, I grew up on pop culture. And I think the message that pop culture in our society often gives to young Americans is, your life's supposed to be easy. Your life's supposed to be one high after another, especially, if you're going to college and you're kind of the middle class, like life's supposed to be easy. And this book sort of countered that message because it was, what I was going through was so difficult. And the premise of the book, as written by psychologists, is that love is the foundation to mental health. That unless you feel valuable as a person at kind of the deepest parts of yourself, you're going to suffer with issues of mental health. And as I was reading the book, it made sense that this was my biggest problem. It wasn't that I didn't have the right job or I didn't have the right girlfriend or spouse or anything material or anything even external. My biggest issue was that I had these feelings of worthlessness and that I didn't feel valuable as a person. And and this is where I needed the most help. And so the book ultimately recommended seeing a therapist. So that's what I did. I was very desperate. I found a therapist, like a classified ad, went to a therapist's office and tried to practice what the book recommended, which, one was learning how to be vulnerable to another human being who could show empathy. And so at the therapist's office was the first time I was really able to tell another human being that I was lonely and I was really scared and I didn't know what to do. And just try to be really authentic and real about where I was to another person. And I really believe that anytime we are speaking honestly and speaking truthfully and vulnerably, we're moving toward God, even if we don't consciously know that we're moving toward God. And so I started seeing a therapist and sharing with my sister, my middle sister, who's older than me. She had gone through very serious depression in college, and I was sharing with her how exhausted I was, that I was really losing the will to live. I was so tired, so mentally drained, so scared. And she didn't say a single word to me. She just embraced me physically, and she did it with such tenderness that I just broke down weeping uncontrollably for 30 straight minutes, just bawling my eyes out in her arms, no words exchanged. But it was an incredibly powerful experience of compassion, of empathy. Theologically, Christians would call it grace, as well, where I really felt understood as a human being in a deep way for the first time. And I remember just feeling like a little child in her arms, just like weeping. And that experience really changed me. It really filled my heart with compassion. And instinctively, after that experience, I sort of knew that compassion is the most important thing in life. That what human beings really need is deep compassion. You know, we're sort of told what you really need is like high paying job and status and wealth. But in reality, it's this deep sense of compassion and understanding and feeling loved and understood. Um, and to this day, I still don't know if my sister would consider herself a Christian because I think there's still too much political baggage with the church. So she was not pointing me to the church after this experience. Um, my parents finally convinced me to try this Korean American church in Maryland. And the way they convinced me to try going to church was to tell me that the senior pastor of this church used to do worse drugs than you did, you know, when he was younger. So that was a good sales pitch, because the last thing I wanted as a, 20 something, is to go to a church and get a lecture from a pastor about saying no to drugs. And so I visited this church. And when I heard the sermon, when I heard the pastor, and I think he gave his testimony, it was like Easter Sunday, it really resonated with me because I really felt like this pastor understands what real compassion is. So I started going to church and listening to sermons, and my fear started to improve. I started understanding the Bible. I started reading the Bible, and that's how I started my Christian journey. But the book that actually convinced me to become a Christian was a book called World Religions, perhaps, ironically, by Houston Smith. And I read about the 5 major religions, but the last chapter was on Christianity. And when I read about the life of Christ, it really resonated with me. And what really struck me about Jesus was his radical compassion for the marginalized and the poor. As an Asian American growing up in Houston, as a Korean American growing up in Houston, feeling marginalized was just part of life. Even just being Korean American in U.S. society, I feel like there's always some level of marginalization. So I really understood what it was like to be marginalized, and when I understood Christ's compassion for really the rejects of society, of those on the margins, the poor, the tax collector, the leper, and when I recognized that Jesus died for all people, and it's maybe especially for the marginalized, that really broke me. And I remember, falling to my knees and just repenting. And I realized up to that point, I had lived my entire life for myself. It was all about my desires. Like, what do I want? and how can I extract it from the world? How can I get more stuff for myself and pleasure? And here was this Jesus showing compassion and love and sacrificing for others, ultimately giving his life for others. And that just blew me away. And I just remember repenting of my selfishness and recognizing, you know what, I'm supposed to follow this Jesus guy because he knows the right way to live life. And so for me, becoming a Christian was like trying to live this way of life that Jesus lived. And so that's how I became a Christian.
So was this soon after that you met a little boy by the name of Daryl, who, from my understanding from reading some of your past stories, that really started to trigger that with your newfound faith, this is maybe a new future career path opened up, or at least a ministry path?
Yeah, I mean, I started, after my experience that, I described, my heart was really filled with compassion for people, especially those who were hurting. And So I started volunteering in, multiple places. And one of them was in the neighborhood where my parents owned a business. So there was a local leader. She was using my parents' Taekwondo studio space for a summer camp, a very, small summer camp that she was running for kids in the neighborhood. And so I started volunteering and helping her out and meeting kids, and met a number of kids, including Daryl. And Daryl was an eighth grader. He was like 5'8", maybe 200 pounds. He was
It's
a
a big
lineman
kid, not a small kid.
Oh yeah, he wasn't a little kid. He was bigger than me. I was really skinny at that point, but he was bigger than me in eighth grade. He was a lineman on his middle school football team. He was a very gentle kid, though, very sweet, gentle young man. But I remember trying to read books with him at this camp and realizing that he could not even read a Dr. Seuss book in eighth grade. And I was just shocked that a young man in eighth grade could not read a Dr. Seuss book. And that really broke my heart for him. But, I was definitely meeting other kids who were really needing attention, needing support academically as well as relationally. And but after seeing Daryl struggle so much, I really felt like, there needs to be an ongoing sort of academic program. And, my parents had space already. And so, that convicted me to say, I really need to start something to help kids in this neighborhood. And there was a Washington Post article on my parents' Taekwondo studio by a local reporter. And somebody at a local church saw that article and came and visited. Her name is Joanne Kim. And she actually, after meeting me and meeting my parents and seeing the studio and hearing about sort of the vision to start a ministry, she actually deferred medical school for 2 years to help Little Lights get off the ground. And so it just started as a small, tutoring program, Bible study inside my parents' Taekwondo studio. This was back in '95. And so that's how Little Lights got started. I remember doing a yard sale and raised a few $100s. We had some space, we had a small van that we could transport kids. So that's how, Little Lights got started. And I definitely was not thinking about it as a career. I mean, I had just gone through the biggest existential crisis. I just wanted to get healthy, both mentally and spiritually. And I wanted to share this love that I had experienced. So my focus was not on a career. My focus is like, how do I share this love and compassion and really the love of Christ with others? Because it was so life-changing for me. And I remember even specifically praying this. I was like, God, if you want me to work at McDonald's the rest of my life, but if I can share this love of Jesus and share the gospel, we would say, share this love of Christ and help bless other people, like, I'm good. That's how passionate I was. And I still, I still mean it. I feel like I could be joyful working in McDonald's. I mean, and that, not to say I would enjoy the job, but I really feel like life is so much bigger than a career or even a marriage or even just your nuclear family. That God is bigger, and that our purpose in life is bigger.
I'm sure you didn't anticipate that 25 years later you'd be standing here realizing that was a very pivotal moment in your life, and for this new ministry, this new community service program, and it's certainly grown tremendously over the last 25 years. Let's talk a little bit about Little Lights and how it's really expanded its ability to touch not only young people, but it's also touched adults as well as families and entire communities. Why did you choose the word Little Light for this organization? Is there a certain meaning behind that?
Yeah. And I remember when I was thinking about the name, I definitely wanted some reference to light, because I had gone through such a dark period in life, and my it was such a very difficult, dark period. And when I experienced this compassion, when I finally understood who Jesus was, it really was like light shining in the darkness. Um, and it was just such a sense of hope. And so I knew I wanted light, a reference to light in the name. So I remember thinking of like lampstand, light post, and then but I was working with kids. And so somehow I thought of little lights, and it kind of stuck. There's the alliteration, little lights, and then I eventually thought of the song, this little light of mine. But it just felt like it made sense. We're working with kids. I wanted light in the name, so that's how the name came about.
Uh, in your mission statement here, you say Little Lights is an urban ministry empowers underserved youth, families, and communities in Washington, D.C. by sharing the hope of Christ through compassionate action, caring relationships, and racial reconciliation. You talked about the importance of compassion and how you came about to discover the importance of compassion. So I understand that. But could you kind of unpack a little bit those three phrases: compassionate action, caring relationships, and racial reconciliation? How does Little Lights touch upon those three aspects in your service to the community?
Yeah, I mean, compassion is definitely at the heart of who we are as an organization and what we're about. But it has to have action behind it, right? It's not just compassion isn't just about warm feelings. And the reality is, the average family that we serve, the household income is somewhere between 12 to 15,000 a year. And so imagine, for those who don't know DC is a very expensive city. And to try to raise a thriving family on $12,000 a year is next to impossible. And so if we're going to be compassionate, we have to provide practical support. We have the tutoring program because there's a huge achievement gap. There's a lot of our students are in school and they're behind. And they don't have the resources at home. I mean, a lot of our kids don't have high-speed internet at home. And so obviously, it's been a tremendous disadvantage during the pandemic, but even before, trying to do well academically without having internet at home. So we provide a lot of tutoring, one-to-one tutoring. We have, programs 6 days a week. We also provide artistic opportunities and performing arts opportunities because they don't often get that at school either. And so we try to be holistic in that sense. We try to provide as many resources as we can for our students because they just don't have access to those resources. We provide free meals every day at programs to make sure our kids have enough to eat throughout the month. So we believe in being very practical. We have a family center. We're helping people with their resumes to find jobs. We have a landscaping business called the Clean Green Team that provides job training as well as ongoing employment. So we're very much about empowering people economically and practically. We have a one-to-one Christian mentoring program, and that's probably a big part of our relationship portion is our one-to-one mentoring program, where it's like a big brother, big sister program that's faith-based, that's for our students in our other programs. And we're very much about relationships. We get to know the families. We're really entrenched in the community. A number of our sites are actually on the grounds of public housing. So the kids can walk to our sites even without crossing a street because it's literally within the apartment complex. And that works perfectly for us because we really want to be part of the fabric of the neighborhood and build relationships, not just programmatically, but really friendships like that. We're part of, their family in a sense. We're like an extended family to them. And so we'll have, kids, years after they leave our program and come back and connect with us and visit. Sometimes they'll work for us part-time. We have 2 of our full-time staff who are alumni because we've maintained those relationships and we've really been part of the community and not just not just a program. So we're very much about those relationships. And then racial reconciliation is ever since the beginning, I've seen, especially maybe in the church, but in society as a whole, the racial divide. The public housing communities we work in are pretty much 100% or 99.9% African American. And so you see the racial divide very clearly in a city like DC, but you definitely also see it in the church, where 11 o'clock Sunday morning still being the most segregated hour in America. There are reasons for that. There's reasons why it's the most segregated hour in America. There's reasons for why there's extreme poverty in a city like DC that's very racialized. And so that's always been on my heart, is how do we bring unity? Because I feel like it's on God's heart to be one, to be united. And Jesus prayed about it. Scripture talks about it, the importance of unity. And so that's always been on my heart, to wanting to see racial healing, because I know that there's a lot of pain when it comes to issues of race that hasn't been healed. And we see the result of that lack of healing in our society today. There's so much strife, there's even violence, there's anger, there's protest, because there are wounds that have not been healed. And unless we really address the wounds, they're not going to be healed. They're not going to heal by themselves. Time by itself is not going to heal these wounds. And so that's always been something I've been passionate about, because I really feel like that's what our society needs. That's what the church needs, if we're going to create a more loving, just world. And so that's something I definitely feel passionate about. And on top of that, at a personal level, I've gained so much by relating and building relationships, especially in the African American community, but also just the diversity at Little Lights. We have volunteers and board members and staff of many different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. And I just love the diversity. I've gained so much personally from that level of diversity and different perspectives and different even ways to worship, that I want other people to be blessed by that as well.
I want to touch on this question of racial relations in a moment, but I just want to dig a little bit deeper into kind of you and how much Little Light has grown in terms of the neighborhoods that you're connecting with. You spoke of community centers, and you're going to be purchasing a building relatively soon, I understand. How many students and families do you minister to on a regular day, like for example, or a regular month? Let's say pre-COVID, and is it primarily in the Washington D.C. area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of our programs are in the district, and pretty much all focused on public housing, so government-run apartment complexes. And we don't actually, and our philosophy is to go deep and not wide. And so we work with about 130 kids, but we see them 5, sometimes 6 days a week. Kids have mentors on weekends, and we see them for many hours and throughout the entire year, because we really believe that if we're really going to help students who are in public housing, who are living in deep poverty, you need a lot of intensity. And so we don't try to work with just lots of students at a superficial level. We try to provide as much wraparound support for a limited number of students. So even though we're in multiple public housing, we really focus on a specific number of kids and try to provide as much wraparound support for the families and for the students. And so through our family center, we have about 300 adults in a year that come through. Our landscaping business employs about nine guys on an ongoing basis. So our philosophy is definitely we're very neighborhood focused. We're about depth rather than breadth. But we have expanded over time, but very organically, because we know that the level of needs, even in just one family, is so deep that we don't want to just be superficial, just to have a lot of students, but to really go deep with a smaller number of students.
I want to touch upon your family too. Obviously, your wife is not only a life partner, but also a partner in your ministry as well. I understand she's the deputy director. Can you share with us how you met her and how she got involved with your work, this work that you're doing together?
Yeah, I remember the first time we met was actually at a post bridal shower social. So I was friends with her future brother-in-law. We were part of like a prayer group, a men's prayer group, and he was getting married to my wife's sister, and so he invited us to this post-social. And actually, I think he was trying to set my wife Mary up with this other guy who had a better paying job. But she found me more interesting, even though my hair is disheveled. I think I just woke up from a nap after working with kids. And so even though I was pretty much making almost no money, she just found me more interesting. And so we just, at a coffee shop, we struck up a conversation while we were with a group of people. And so that's how we first met. And I just found her very interesting, and she found me very interesting. But she was living in New York at the time, so I wasn't thinking like, oh, could be my future spouse. But we definitely connected during that social and felt the connection. But then she ended up moving down to DC after finishing grad school, and she saw an ad in her church bulletin for Little Lights, for our camp, because she was attending a church that we had a relationship with. And so she called me and said, I want to volunteer. And so I just told her to bring a backpack and and show up. We really didn't have a huge formal process for volunteering at that point. And so and then we got to know each other better as she started volunteering at our camp.
And I imagine soon after you got married, and now you have two kids, right? And how old are your kids right now?
One just turned 17 and one just turned 15.
Okay. And they're two teenagers. So having teenagers, I know the joys and challenges of having teenagers in the house. I'm interested in that you also decided to move into the neighborhood where you're ministering to the the community that you're serving. I'm assuming you're still living in the neighborhood right now as well. Is that correct?
It's actually interesting because the public housing community, the neighborhood was gentrifying. So we actually couldn't afford to live right next to the public housing because the prices had gone up enough where it was a little out of our reach to live there. So we ended up living in terms of the neighborhood, a lower income neighborhood in Anacostia. And so we bought a small home there. And so it was actually about a 5-minute drive away, because the neighborhood where the public housing was and that we were working with, the housing prices around it had started going up. And so our main office is now very few blocks from the public housing, but we have been living in Anacostia, which is a little few minute drive away, but in a non-gentrified neighborhood, I guess, and in some ways a lower income neighborhood than where the public housing actually is situated.
So tell me about your kids. Tell me about how they felt about, I guess, in some ways they're like missionary kids, right? They came together, and oftentimes I've talked to parents who have been, either traveling abroad because of the parents' work, and the kids are brought along, and how the work you've been doing has impacted your kids.
Yeah, our kids have grown up like helping us out, going into public housing, volunteering, also participating, like they're part of the choir that when they were younger. And I think they probably don't fully understand how unusual their childhood is. And maybe until maybe they go to college and they realize that almost nobody else, had that kind of upbringing. Um, I think, they haven't been without. Like, they've been able to go to good schools. Uh, you know, they've never gone hungry. They've always had internet at home, and so I think they've been shielded. We've shielded them, quite a bit. Um, but I think they'll come to appreciate their childhood more, I think, later, recognizing that they've got to build relationships with, diverse people, and to visit churches that, not everybody has visited, and just experience the diversity that come from Little Lights. They're actually taking the race literacy class with a couple of their friends online with me right now, and learning about those types of issues in the home and at Little Lights. I think will definitely be beneficial to them. And but it's been hard too, because they, I think they felt isolated from their friends sometimes, because of, we live further away from a lot of where their friends live, and so they also know there's been drawbacks to our lifestyle. But by and large, I mean, they've seen us at home, because flexibility in our schedule, so we've been able to be home with them for many meals, and make sure we take vacations and things like that. So I think they don't have any complaints. They know that they've had good lives, and I think they almost feel guilty sometimes, because they see our students who struggle, who don't have internet at home, and then they have all these resources. So I think in some ways they feel guilty that they've been so blessed. So, but I have great kids, wonderful kids. Of course, occasional attitude, but as teens, but they're amazing kids.
So it sounds like this has been not only a tremendous partnership with your wife Mary, but also your children have been involved in supporting this community ministry that you've been doing. And now, as I mentioned before, it's 25 years have gone through this journey for 25 years. I imagine it hasn't all been a walk through the park, as they say, right? There have been challenges and difficulties. And I've heard other interviews where, because you're so invested in these communities, you celebrate with the community, but you also suffer with the community. And these communities that you're, serving are going through some difficult times, not only now, but even before the COVID situation, they've been going through some difficult times. Share with me about that some of the struggles that you've had with your work, and have you had failures and things that you wish you could do again, if you could do a ministry like this again?
Yeah, lots of ups and downs. I mean, lots of painful experiences. I mean, we've been to a lot of funerals. We've gone to a lot of candlelight vigils of both young and old who have passed away, whether it's through violence or whether it's through illness. So there's a lot of sadness, and how difficult it is for these families to try to get out of poverty. I mean, in a city like DC, especially, where housing is so expensive, and if you don't have a college degree, it can be so difficult. Um, we just try to learn from our mistakes. Of course, you make a lot of mistakes. I mean, I did not come in with a lot of experience, and a lot of it has to do with just being naive too, and knowing even just basic things like how to hire well. And I think anyone who's ever even started, let's say, a business, can understand you can make mistakes in things like who you hire, and you want to give everyone a chance. You want to believe the best ever in everybody. Sometimes you end up hiring someone that doesn't work out, and you might have to fire them, and that can be very challenging and difficult. Fundraising and nonprofits can be challenging, and It's something you have to be persistent at and create a system, right, to be able to do this, and to make a sustainable organization. Um, it requires a lot of persistence, but it also requires asking for help and knowing that you can't do it all by yourself. Like I know, after all these years, like things that I'm good at and things that I'm not so good at. And it's recognizing the things that you're not good at and finding people who you can trust that and who are good at those things. And you really have to build a strong team and a strong culture. And a lot of that you have to learn, and you have to learn sometimes from mistakes. And so I've definitely made a lot of mistakes, but none of them have been fatal, thankfully. And so, and as long as they're not fatal, you can learn from it and get better and ask for help, whether it's through hiring staff or volunteers, board members. I mean, we've had to grow our board and strengthen our board of directors and find the right people who fit into the culture, who believe in our mission. And you're always going to make mistakes, and that's just part of it. We don't expect perfection. But we always are trying to grow, always trying to improve. I mean, that's just part of our DNA. Is like we're always trying to improve, and mistakes can be okay. We are going to make mistakes, but we always want to try to improve so we don't make it again, or we do things better than before. And I think those are some of the things that I've learned. And there's definitely been painful experiences of having to let go of people, or people leaving, unhappy with the organization, or even parents who've been mad at us because we didn't, provide something that they needed. Or there's always criticism is definitely going to be part of any nonprofit, any ministry, I think any business too. That you have to take the criticism, and you have to determine what's legitimate in the criticism and correct those things, but then also not take it personally and let certain things roll off, when they're not constructive, or it's not helpful. And so I think one thing I've had to learn is to try to not take things personally when there's criticism, because there's always going to be there. And but to also receive criticism in a way that can be constructive and help the organization. And so I think that's served us well.
Obviously, we're living through this COVID-19 pandemic currently, and how has it impacted the public health, the economics, the mental health of the communities that you're serving? And how has it impacted your organization specifically?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the people we're serving, I mean, it's obviously challenging, but one thing about our families and our students is they know how to deal with difficult circumstances, because it's their life. I mean, they've had to deal with violence in their community. They've had to deal with poverty. They've had to deal with, not having enough food on the table and trying to survive, not having a working phone, or not having internet and trying to. So, our families are resourceful. They do rely on each other. They do rely on organizations like ours, and try to fill in the gaps best they can. But our students are very resilient. Our families are resilient. They're survivors. They know they know how to survive, and so they're surviving through this time. For our students or young students, they probably don't realize how detrimental it is for them not to have school. Some of them might be thinking, "Oh, this is great. I have so much more free time to play," and so they may not understand how detrimental this time is to their education. But we've been providing a lot of virtual tutoring and virtual instruction during this time, and a number of our kids have been accessing that. And we've handed out tablets that have internet installed so that our kids can continue to learn. But our families are resilient, and but I haven't heard too many cases of people actually having COVID, thankfully. But people are surviving, like in some ways, like they always have. And so, but with the organization, we've had to shift everything. Everything has shifted. we're mostly working from home and doing virtual programs mostly. We do emergency relief. We pass out groceries. We pass out masks. Um, pretty much on a daily basis. We still pass out diapers. So we have relief services at our sites to provide those physical resources to the community. But yeah, a lot of our programming has been virtual. In this fall, starting mid-September, we are going to provide some learning hubs for kids, to a few students at a time, to come to our center to get the computer access, to get a little extra help, with the social distancing, with all the masks and safety protocols. So we are going to start some in-person programming. But yeah, our fundraising event, the fall benefit, is all going to be virtual. So we've had to shift. I mean, none of us had used Zoom before the pandemic. I think I'd heard of it, but none of us had used it. But now it's like obviously an essential part of our work. And even teaching the race literacy class that was in person before, virtually, that has become a bigger part of what we do. And it's become bigger because it's virtual, that more people are accessing it. And so I think in some ways we're also learning new things during this time that I think will benefit us in the future, like using this technology. I think will have benefits in the future, even as it's absolutely necessary right now. But yeah, every aspect of our organization has changed.
Well, in certain ways, you've discovered a tool to scale the good work you're doing, right? In terms of especially the race relations class race literacy class you're teaching. What would you recommend to the Korean American community specifically that we should be doing more to help heal some of these racial divides, build bridges, right, with the African American community, especially right now, because it seems like we're in a very fluid and a momentous and an awakening time where people are asking the questions that you've just asked and learning more about history. And I think a lot of people are anxious. What more can we do? There must be something to change the narrative of race, right?
I think there's an inner work and an outer work. One is learning some of the history and reading African American writers or watching documentaries that help us understand this history. Why is there this enormous wealth disparity among blacks and whites in the United States? And until we sort of grapple with that and begin to understand it, our solution may be off. So there's the inner work, and also Asian Americans. Also, we have to process how ideas of white supremacy, or you might say white superiority, have impacted even our sense of identity and our worldview. A lot of us have grown up believing that it's better to be white, or there's something better about being white than something else. We have to analyze those things. How do we gain those ideas? How has it impacted us? How has it influenced even our vision of ourselves? I mean, some of us may even have levels of self-hatred being Asian in America, right? Unless we process that. So there's education that we definitely have to do, as well as processing of our own, even a sense of identity. But there's also the outer work of, building relationships in a humble way, not as like I'm here to save, but I'm here to learn, I'm here to serve, I'm here to be with, rather than I'm here to save you and to fix your problems, because I don't have those problems. I think it's the character of humility, of entering into relationships with African Americans and entering into African American communities with a humble spirit and a learning spirit. We do have, the reality, we do have so much to learn from the African American community. I mean, they have dealt with race issues for 400 years. I mean, they have a philosophy, they have academia, they have a spiritual theology that has confronted racism for hundreds of years, that we can learn from, even to get a better understanding of who God is and God's heart for issues of justice. And so I think we have to go with a humble spirit and learn the history and recognize just how persistent systemic racism and historical racism has been in the United States. And that we entered as immigrants into this really a toxic context and toxic atmosphere of race. And we've got no training on it. Our parents didn't know what they were getting into. We still don't quite understand what we're in. It's really a toxic atmosphere of race, and it has hundreds of years of history. And we have to begin to understand our own environment and context, I think, to be part of the solution. And because race impacts every aspect of life, every institution, our church institutions, our theology, our identities. It's a very powerful concept, and it's a very powerful aspect of our cultural DNA. But yeah, the race literacy class, I think, has definitely opened up a lot of eyes. It's an 11-week class, and but I think it's really helped people to begin the journey of really understanding what racism is and what the ideology of race and where it comes from.
Is this class taken by both, I imagine, from all different racial backgrounds, including African American students as well? How do, in these classes, how do your students respond? Particularly African American students. I'm interested in terms of how they engage as you're bringing this, I guess, these ideas, the history, and other things, especially in this time right now, where our country is asking those questions about the issues related to race, and on top of a very politically partisan environment that we're all living in. I'm curious how the students are engaging with you as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, we've had all 3 summer classes have sold out. Like 120 to 130 people per class. I think most of the African Americans who take out, pretty much so far, every African American that has taken the class has appreciated the class. Because one, it explains for them the issues of racism and systemic racism. So they don't have to explain it themselves. So in some ways, it takes some of the burden off of African Americans to try to explain what's going on in America and what has gone on in America. And I think for a lot of African Americans, even though they are better, more knowledgeable about this history than the average white person or the average Asian American or Korean American, they still learn a lot of new material because it's just not something we learn in school. And so I mean, I've definitely had African Americans just have aha moments and just like, oh, that's why my grandparents had this issue. Or and one participant said, I remember looking down on family members who are living on public housing and sort of feeling shame. But now I understand why that happened. So I feel less shame toward them. And they've actually repented of feeling shameful toward family members after understanding the history better. So I think it's been liberating for African Americans as well as others. I mean, and there's this is not an easy class. There's some really tough, hard truths, disturbing truths, uncomfortable truths in the class. Some people will drop out. I mean, especially whites who really don't want to learn this or feel troubled by it or too uncomfortable by it. So definitely people have dropped out. But more often than not, people are like extremely grateful to learn. And a very common response is, I can't believe I learned this when I'm 30 or 40 or 50. I can't believe I didn't learn this before. Once you do take that, you realize, how could we not learn this? You really can't understand American society without understanding race. It's just, and people will be confused about what's going on perpetually until they begin to understand how race has worked in American society.
Do you bring faith into this as well?
Yeah, I mean, the curriculum is geared for church-going folks. There's a lot of history, there's some science, but there's also some scripture about, and it's really about Christian ethics, and it's also about discipleship, that confronting racism, confronting injustice is a biblical call. It is on the heart of God. God, why would God not care about human suffering? I mean, in Nazi Germany, like, how would we respect a God who didn't care that 10 million people were being slaughtered by the government? Like, how would we respect a God that just turned a blind eye to that and say that's not a big deal because it's done by government? Same thing with North Korea. It would be unimaginable for me to think God doesn't care about people being persecuted in North Korea. Of course he cares. Like, it's human beings. Human beings are suffering. Anywhere that human beings are suffering, God cares about that. And anywhere there's oppression by a government and other forces, of course God cares about that. I would not want to worship a God that was so uncaring about the suffering of human beings. And so that's really what it's all about. But somehow we've got it so messed up that if it's done by government or done in some sort of corporate way, God doesn't care. It's only about our individual sin or my sexual sin or whatever that God cares about, or, homosexuality. Like, God gets really angry about homosexuality, but 10 million people being slaughtered by government. Oh, God doesn't care about that. Like, how would we respect a God like that? And I think so. And I think this is how we have to correct even things like our theology, because it's been influenced by a history of oppression to almost convince us to turn a blind eye toward injustice.
So generous with your time, and thank you very much for sharing your heart with us. If someone is interested in taking your class, how do they take your class? Is there a way to sign up for it? Are you still teaching that for the fall?
Go to littlelights.org. You can also email raceliteracy@littlelights.org to get more information. Just say, hey, I'd like to learn about when the next class is. Raceliteracy@littlelights.org. You can go to littlelights.org website and look under programs and find race literacy there as well. But probably the easiest way is to email us at raceliteracy@littlelights.org.
Okay. Wonderful. I have one final question to end our podcast here together is, if you could meet your 19-year-old self,
19.
What would you tell the 19-year-old Steve as a word of wisdom?
One, that there's more to life than being popular and having a good time and finding a girlfriend. God is real, that God is love, and that as hard as it is to believe that there is a bigger meaning to life, and that God actually does love you and care about you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insights and really opening up your life to all of us. So we really appreciate the work you're doing, the service you're providing for your community, and really being a leader and example for the American community at large. And we wish you the best, especially on this monumental milestone year for Little Light's 25th anniversary. And the work that you, your wife, Mary, and of course your most capable staff and volunteers have been giving everything of themselves. So thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks, Abe. It's great spending this time with you.
Thank you for tuning into the Korean American Perspectives podcast. Head over to councilka.org for the show notes of this episode and see exciting upcoming programs at CKA. That's councilka.org.